High in the Andes, where clouds cling to the rocks, and the air itself seems to push a person back down, there stand walls that still should not exist. These are not just ancient ruins. These are not just the stone remains of a great civilization. And they are definitely not ordinary masonry that can be explained with the phrase, well, people tried hard. Because in Peru, there are structures where stones the size of a bus are fitted to one another, as if they were not cut by hand, but designed on a perfect digital model, without mortar, without gaps, without any room for error. And all of this, in the mountains, at an altitude where even climbing is hard, let alone hauling multi-ton blocks. And the strangest thing in this story is not that the ruins look incredible. The strangest thing is that the more carefully we study them, the worse the familiar explanations work. At first, it seems that this is simply outstanding craftsmanship. Then, that it is an engineering miracle. And then a truly disturbing thought arrives. What if we completely misunderstand the level of the ancient world? Because these walls do not simply impress. They behave as if they were created by people who knew far more about stone, geometry, stability, and the earth itself than we are used to allowing them in textbooks. Today, we will figure out why the megaliths of Peru frighten engineers, leave historians at a loss, and increasingly hint at a lost chapter of human history. And the farther we go, the less comfortable this subject will become. Because perhaps the real mystery here is not in the stones, but in why humanity spent so long pretending that they could be looked at without too much attention. Walls that do not look like the past. The first thing that strikes you in Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, or Machu Picchu is not even the scale, but the feeling of wrongness. You look at these walls and feel that in front of you is something from the wrong era. The stones fit into one another too precisely. The shapes are too complex. The fit is too clean. There is too little chaos for supposedly ancient, manual, primitive work. Usually, old masonry is read by the eyes quickly. Blocks, joints, irregularities, traces of time. But here the gaze seems to stumble. It looks for familiar logic and does not find it. Because instead of ordinary rows, you see giant polygonal blocks, each of which seems to have been created specifically for the neighboring ones. Some of these blocks weigh dozens of tons, some more than 100. And they are not merely placed side by side. They are interlocked, as if the entire wall were a huge stone mechanism in which every element had to fall strictly into its own place, without cement, without metal ties, without thick seams hiding mistakes. And the closer you get, the stronger the feeling becomes that this is not rough but reliable, but the opposite, almost frighteningly precise. Such walls do not create the impression of ancient poverty. They create the impression of discipline, technology, control. As if someone in the past not only knew how to build, but built with an understanding that we underestimate today. And it is exactly at this moment that the first unpleasant feeling appears. Perhaps in front of us is not simply a monument of the past. Perhaps it is a piece of evidence. Ollantaytambo, when the mountain itself does not want to believe what is happening. If Sacsayhuaman frightens with precision, then Ollantaytambo crushes with logistics. Because here the question is no longer only how the stone was worked. Here the landscape itself seems to scream, "This should not have happened." The complex is located high in the mountains. The terrain is difficult, broken, inconvenient. And when you start looking at the size of the blocks, at their position, and at the possible delivery routes, the mind hits a wall. The stones had to be quarried, then moved, then raised, then turned, then seated with a precision at which one mistake could destroy the entire structure. And all of this, without cranes, without trucks, without steel cables, without the familiar engineering infrastructure. Today, a similar operation in such terrain would cost enormous money. It would be a very demanding construction project involving machinery, specialists, calculations, temporary roads, risk insurance, and a colossal amount of preparation time. And here the result looks as if someone did all of this not through pain, but confidently and according to plan. Especially strong is the impression made by those blocks that seem to have been placed against the very rules of the terrain, as if it was not enough for the builders merely to erect a sacred object, and they decided to do it in the most inconvenient conditions possible, and still win. And the longer you look at these stones, the stronger the feeling becomes that some key piece of knowledge is missing here. Because the physical result exists. It stands before us. It is heavy, real, tangible. But the technological chain that should have led to such a result remains blurry. That is why Ollantaytambo looks not like just a monument. It looks like the scene of a crime against the familiar version of history. Sacsayhuaman, a stone challenge to common sense. Sacsayhuaman is the place where official history begins to sound especially strained. From above, it seems to be simply a massive fortress above Cusco. But once you come closer, it becomes clear that the word fortress is too weak here. These walls feel not like the defense of a city, but like a demonstration of capabilities that should not have existed in those conditions. The zigzag lines of the walls are impressive in themselves. But the main thing is the stones. Enormous, heavy, multi-part, complex in shape, they seem deliberately made to destroy the very idea of ordinary construction logic. One block can join several neighbors at once at different angles. In some places, a stone literally cuts into other elements, as if it were set in place after a perfect fitting. And this is where the uncomfortable questions begin. How is such a shape created at all? How is such precision checked? How is a multi-ton block turned to the needed angle and set into a wall without heavy machinery? How is this done in the mountains, at altitude, without modern surveying, cranes, and tools that we would consider sufficient? With each new question, it becomes harder and harder to accept the simple version about a great many people, a great deal of time, and a great deal of effort. Because effort does not replace method. Effort does not create complex geometry by itself. Effort does not explain the perfect joining of multi-ton blocks. Effort does not turn chaotic labor into an engineering system. And Sacsayhuaman is precisely a system. Moreover, one that survived centuries, wars, conquests, earthquakes, and the destruction of everything that was built nearby later. And when later buildings cracked and crumbled, these walls remained in place as if they knew more about the behavior of the earth than the European builders who arrived centuries afterward. And this is already truly disturbing, because at this moment, Sacsayhuaman ceases to be merely an ancient wonder. It becomes proof that someone knew far more than it was comfortable for us to admit for a long time. Walls that survived the blows of the earth. If these megaliths were simply heavy and simply beautiful, the story would already be astonishing. But the problem is that they are also too durable. Peru lies in a zone of serious seismic activity. The ground here has more than once shown that human self-confidence means nothing to it. Cities shook, structures were destroyed. Later buildings, built in a different era, with different traditions, could not withstand the blows. But the ancient megalithic walls could, and that changes everything. Because stability under earthquake conditions is no longer about brute force. It is about understanding the behavior of a structure under dynamic load, about how elements distribute stress, about how a system must work not only at rest, but at the moment of impact. When mortar cracks in ordinary masonry, weak points appear. When a structure is too rigid, it may simply fail to forgive displacement. But these ancient walls seem to be created by a different logic. They stand not in spite of earthquakes, but almost as if designed with them in mind. And at this moment, a particularly unpleasant question arises. What if the builders knew perfectly well what they were doing? What if the strange shapes of the blocks, the complex interlocks, and the absence of mortar were not a primitive lack of technology, but the opposite, a choice in favor of a smarter design? Before us may be the trace of a very mature school of construction that understood the nature of risk better than many who came later. And if that is so, then the story about the development of civilization in a straight line begins to look suspiciously naive. Stone that did not want to yield. There is one more detail that makes this whole subject even more unpleasant for simple explanations. It is the material itself. When people hear the word ruins, they often imagine something more or less workable: soft stone, brick, clay, limestone. But in Peru, in many cases, we are talking about hard rock, material that even in our time, you would not call convenient for ultra-precise processing. In other words, this is not a situation of they took whatever was easier and chipped it as best they could. On the contrary, the impression is created that the ancient masters deliberately worked with an extremely inconvenient, heavy, stubborn material, and still achieved a result that even today would look expensive, complex, and technologically ambitious. And now add the shapes of the blocks to this. These are not always simple rectangles. Very often they are complex polyhedrons that had to coincide perfectly with several neighbors at once. That means someone understood in advance what the entire interlocking system would look like. Someone controlled not only the overall outline, but also the seating of every plane. And here, the story begins to sound almost sinister, because the harder the material, the higher the demands on the tool, the time, the margin for error, and the skill. And when at the same time you see a surface that in places seems too even, too neat, too clean for rough manual impact, a question arises that can no longer be silenced with beautiful general words. By exactly what method was this done? Not in general terms, not in the spirit of, well, somehow they worked it, but specifically, where are the traces of sufficient tools? Where is the convincingly reconstructed process? Where is the reproducible model that answers all the questions at once? Weight, shape, precision, material, and final stability. And as long as there is no such complete answer, the stones themselves continue to press on history by their mere existence. The Inca and what is uncomfortable to say out loud. The Inca were an outstanding civilization. That is not up for debate. Their roads, terraces, temples, labor organization, administrative system, all of it is genuinely impressive. But this is precisely why the subject of the megaliths is so delicate. Because the more carefully researchers look at different types of masonry in Peru, the more often the feeling arises that not everything here was created in the same period, and not everything was made by the same hands. In a number of places, it is as if we see two levels of heritage. Above, later, understandable, still powerful architecture. And below, foundational megalithic blocks so powerful and precise that they seem to belong to another chapter of history. This does not mean that the Inca did nothing. On the contrary, it may mean something far more interesting. That even the Inca encountered the heritage of something ancient, already standing before them, and integrated it into their sacred and political geography. And here the story becomes almost dangerous, because as soon as you allow that some of the most mysterious structures could have been inherited rather than created by the Inca from scratch, the next question immediately arises. Then who was there before them? Not in the mythological sense, not in a pretty tourist legend, but on a real historical scale. Who was capable of working with such weight? such shape, such precision, and such stability? And why has so little direct memory of this been preserved? The more you think about it, the stronger the feeling becomes that we are looking not at the completed history of Peru, but at a layered manuscript from which the most important pages were torn out long before anyone tried to read it. Joints that behave like mockery. One of the strongest visual blows in this entire subject is the joints. They are exactly what breaks the psyche of the viewer, the tourist, the researcher, the engineer, everyone really. Because you see giant blocks and expect roughness. At least a little. At least something. A gap somewhere, a shim somewhere, an attempt to hide imprecision with mortar. But there is almost none of that. On the contrary, the impression is created that the builders were obsessed with fitting stone into stone. So much so that sometimes the joint turns into the main argument against the convenient version of history. Where other cultures solved the question with mass, here it was solved with precision. Where you usually expect good enough, here it is, as if the principle was either perfect or not at all. That is why these ruins look so modern on the level of sensation. Not in style, but in internal logic. Because a modern person associates high precision with machines, calculations, templates, dimensional control. And here all of that seems to be present, only in a world where, according to the official version, none of it should exist. The joints are not merely tight. In places they look humiliatingly precise, as if the past deliberately left us a silent question. So, are you absolutely sure that we were primitive? And the more carefully you peer into such masonry, the more frightening one thought becomes. Perhaps the walls themselves were calculated not merely for beauty and strength. Perhaps precision here was functional. That is no longer aesthetics. It is engineering. And engineering of that level is not born by accident. Lost knowledge. The version that frightens most of all. When people hear the word mystery, they often go to extremes immediately. Some demand that everything be explained as dully and safely as possible. Others, on the contrary, instantly summon aliens, superpowers, and fantasy. But the most disturbing explanation may turn out to be far more earthly. What if the ancient world was not more primitive, but more complex? What if there were cultures that in certain areas, stoneworking, geometry, hydraulics, work with terrain, structural stability, reached a level that we simply are not used to attributing to them today? Not with computers and lasers, but with different methods of thought, craft, and organization. This version frightens more than any fantasy precisely because it is plausible. Knowledge can be lost, a tradition can be broken. A school of masters can be destroyed by war, catastrophe, famine, conquest, epidemic, religious prohibition, or simply a change of era. We are used to thinking that history moves only forward, but the real world is not so convenient. Civilizations rise, collapse, are forgotten. Skills disappear, sometimes without a trace. And if a very complex building tradition existed in Peru long before the known empires, it could very well have died in such a way that only the result reached the descendants, but not the method. And then the megaliths of the Andes are not an anomaly. They are the last cry of a vanished competence. Not myth, not magic, but the lost technology of a culture that time erased. And if this version is even partially true, it changes not only the conversation about Peru, it changes the very way we look at humanity's past. Because then, the most impressive ruins of antiquity are not exceptions to the rule. They are traces of those peaks that we simply failed to notice in time. Why this could have disappeared without a trace. At first glance, it seems impossible that such powerful knowledge could disappear. But in fact, history constantly reminds us, almost anything can disappear. Peru is a land of earthquakes, landslides, sudden natural blows, extraordinarily difficult terrain, and human catastrophes. If anywhere, an entire building tradition could vanish, leaving behind only stone, the Andes are almost perfectly suited for it. Wood will rot, textiles will decay, metal will be melted down or disappear, organic materials will go back into the ground, oral memory will break off in a few generations, but stone will remain. And that is a very important thought. Perhaps we are seeing not everything that remained of a civilization, but only the hardest, most stubborn, most silent percentage of its legacy, only that which cannot be quickly destroyed. Now add conquest to that. When new forces enter a region, especially religiously and politically aggressive ones, they do not merely take power. They rewrite memory. They destroy temples. They suppress local traditions. They devalue earlier knowledge. They build the new upon the old, literally and symbolically. And then a very grim picture arises. First, some complex building culture disappears or degrades. Then its legacy is partially used by descendants. Then, a new era arrives and erases even the memory of what existed before it. In the end, walls remain. Only walls. And the feeling that they know more than all the texts written after their creation. How much this would cost today, and why the thought of it feels unsettling. Sometimes the best way to feel the scale of an ancient object is not to argue about dates and theories, but to translate it into the language of modern money, logistics, and risk. Imagine that today you were commissioned with a project in the mountains. You need to quarry colossal stone blocks, move them across extremely difficult terrain, raise them to altitude, seat them with perfect precision, account for earthquake resistance, solve the drainage issue, and do all of this so that the result stands not for 5 years and not for 50, but for centuries. This would not merely be an expensive project. It would be a project on the level of an engineering nightmare. You would need surveys, geodesy, machinery, lifting systems, logistics routes, a team of designers, insurance, constant control, and a budget that would make most clients lose any desire to continue the conversation at the very first stage. And now remove everything modern from it. Remove heavy machinery. Remove metal of the required level. Remove the familiar methods of measurement and assembly. Remove roads. Remove convenient delivery. And still leave the result of almost frighteningly high quality. That is why the megaliths of Peru affect the imagination so strongly. They force you not merely to admire antiquity. They force you to recalculate the scale internally and admit what we are seeing in labor costs, complexity, and level of organization looks monstrously expensive, even by the standards of today's world. Which means something much greater stood behind it than simply a lot of people carried stones. Machu Picchu. Beauty. Behind which cold calculation hides. Machu Picchu is romanticized far too often. It is shown as a city in the clouds, a beautiful symbol of empire, almost a postcard wonder. But precisely this presentation prevents us from seeing how unsettling this place is in engineering terms. Because building there is already a challenge. A narrow mountain ridge, altitude, difficult soil, landslide danger, seismic activity. Water that, if handled incorrectly, could turn a beautiful slope into a catastrophe. And yet on this ridge there appears not a chaotic set of buildings, but a thought-out system. Terraces, drainage, load distribution, work with the slope, water control. All of it looks not like inspired improvisation, but like mature understanding of the environment. This is very important, because the great structures of the past have two levels of admiration. The first is visible: beauty, scale, effect. The second is more dangerous: the realization that the object was built where an error is not merely undesirable, but fatal. Machu Picchu belongs exactly to this category. It is not merely beautiful, It is too intelligently arranged to write everything off to luck, enthusiasm, and brute force. And the deeper you study not the facade, but the infrastructure of the place, the clearer you understand. Behind it stood a way of thinking that looked at the mountain not as an obstacle, but as an equation. And equations of that scale are not solved by heroism alone. Science can no longer get away with general phrases. The most interesting thing now is that the time of convenient formulations is gradually ending. Earlier, many such questions could be answered vaguely. The ancients were inventive. Collective labor works wonders. Much is still unknown. All of that sounds reasonable. But when precise measurements, digital models, surface analysis, terrain mapping, and closer study of the engineering properties of objects enter the picture, general phrases begin to be insufficient because the numbers are merciless. The weight of the blocks does not disappear. The hardness of the material does not disappear. The complexity of the roots does not disappear. The precision of the fit does not disappear. The seismic resistance does not disappear. And when all of this comes together into one picture, even a very cautious researcher is forced to admit, we do not have a simple answer. This does not mean that science is powerless. On the contrary, it means that honest science begins exactly where it stops pretending that everything has long been understood. Right now, perhaps, we are at that interesting moment when technologies for studying the past are finally beginning to catch up with the past itself. And every new precise look at these structures does not so much close the subject as make it even deeper. In other words, the main intrigue does not fade. It intensifies. Because if even with modern capabilities, we still cannot calmly and consistently close the question, how exactly was this done? Then, the ancient stones still retain the advantage. And that sounds almost humiliating for our self-confident civilization. The most dangerous thought in this entire story. But perhaps the main danger of these ruins is not even that they are ancient, heavy, and poorly explained. The main danger is in the conclusion to which they gradually lead. What if ancient man was not an almost savage ancestor, slowly crawling toward our greatness? What if in different eras and in different regions of the world, there had already appeared the most complex centers of knowledge, which then disappeared before they had time to fit into the convenient school scheme? That is a very uncomfortable thought, because it strikes not at one mystery in Peru. It strikes at our vanity. We like to think that everything smartest, most precise, and most advanced belongs to us. That the summit is now. That antiquity is necessarily deficiency. But the stone walls of the Andes look at this confidence as if they have long known its price. They survived empires, survived conquerors, survived earthquakes, survived explanations. And they still stand above the clouds, like a silent challenge to all modern condescension toward the past. That is exactly why they are so mesmerizing. Not because they promise a fairy tale, but because they force us to reconsider reality. Perhaps we are not discovering something incredible in them. Perhaps we are simply remembering very slowly what humanity is actually capable of. So who placed these stones in the mountains of Peru? The Inca? A more ancient civilization? A people whose knowledge was lost long before the appearance of the empires known to us? Or a building tradition that we still underestimate simply because it does not fit into the familiar picture of the development of the world? For now, there is no final answer. But there is something that can no longer be brushed aside. These ruins are not merely beautiful remains of the past. They are one of the harshest stone arguments against a simplified history of humanity. They are too precise, too heavy, too stable, too intelligent, and too expensive in the scale of the work for them to be dismissed with one dull phrase from a textbook. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is not even how the ancient masters managed to deal with stone. but why we spent so long convincing ourselves that they could not. Be sure to write everything you think about this in the comments, and subscribe to the Top Facts channel for the most incredible collections of facts and videos from all over the internet. Thank you for watching, and right now watch our next video, which has appeared on your screen